Rainbow. Um, I'm excited to be here. I'm Jeremy Azuma, final year business analytics student from the University of Ghana Business School. Uh, I also serve as the second deputy speaker for the University of Ghana Parliament House. Um, I hope to have fruitful discussions today concerning the topic before us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Kahoria.
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, everyone. My name is Kahuria Faith. I am a second year pursuing bachelor's degree in economics and finance. Privileged to be the KESA, Kenyatta University Economic Students Association, elected chairperson. I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to a nice session and an interactive one. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Madam President. Fun fact, she's the first female president in a long time in KU. So, congratulations to Kahoria. We're excited to have you. We now move on to Sydney.
Well, good evening. My name is Mabuka Sydney from Kabarak University. Actually, I'm the economics director. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Economics director. Fun fact about Sydney: we went to high school together. We are those guys who tell you I went to Starehe, so that you know. Anyway, thank you so much, Sydney. I now move on to Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. And so I am Andrew Baka, a final year student of the University of Ghana, studying finance, banking and finance and economics. I also serve as the first deputy speaker of the University of Ghana Business School General Assembly. And I'm hoping that this session is going to be educative, and at the end, we are all going to take something home.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that introduction. You can see you have very stacked people. And finally, Geoffrey.
Uh, Good evening, guys. My name is Geoffrey. I'm from Chuka University. I'm a student of economics and sociology in my final year. I'm glad to be here and I look forward to a fruitful session.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. As everyone has heard, we have a very stacked panel with us today. So anticipate very interesting perspectives, and I hope all of you are going to learn by the end of this. At this point, I'd like us to delve right into the conversation that we're here to have. And to start us off, I'd like all panelists to help us understand something. What sorry, I don't think I'll take questions at this point. We'll have questions at the tail end. So after the panel discussion has happened, you're going to have the questions then. Yeah. So on to the first question. What does the global war economy look like, and why have has it had such a significant impact on fuel prices? To start this conversation, I'd like Jeremy to kick us off, and then we'll follow with the order that the panel introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Michael. Um, this is very significant given the recent global wars that have been happening recently. And so it's very important for us to understand how it's affecting the oil economy in that regard. Um, I want to begin by pointing out that when I got up, for example, today, I used a toothbrush that came from refining petroleum, crude oil into petroleum products. That made the plastic that I used. Um, I went to take a shower. The shampoo and the soaps all come from petroleum products. The buckets I used, I picked the vehicle to transport me to campus. It was fueled by petroleum products that are refined from crude oil. The food I ate that was cooked on a stove or was used, that was um, supported by the use of LPG, etc. What this shows to you is that on a daily basis, the average individual persistently participates in that fuel economy indirectly by depending entirely on products that are made from this. What that inevitably means is that at the point at which global wars in and of itself put this particular process in jeopardy that produces this very product and allows us to sustain our life in that particular regard, it becomes very detrimental to the average individual and the way they live. But what this economy has looked like over the years is that you've had things like the Russia-Ukraine war that has created, and that's the war that necessarily affected supply chains in that particular regard. Supply chains in the sense that I, in the sense that there were sanctions at the time, and these sanctions in of themselves made it very difficult for states to be able to, first of all, made it very difficult for access to consistent supply of petroleum products, of refined fuel in that particular regard for states that were heavily dependent on it. And as I've shown to you, we need these things to survive. Then you have the very recent one of um, very ship and the war creating shipping blockades. That is the Strait of Hormuz, which is very important route for moving fuel from the Middle East across to parts of the world. What that means in a sense is that that particular strategic route being blocked makes it very expensive to transport fuel in that particular regard. But now the dominance and the control of
Thank you,
that particular
Jeremy.
space
Please allow me
makes
to
it.
cut you short there, Jeremy. I think you've made an interesting contribution there when you were explaining how the Strait of Hormuz has been affected, specifically causing the bottleneck in transmission of fuel. Allow me at this point to have Faith weigh in a little bit on this. So, Faith, what do you think on this? So, what do you think the global war economy looks like? Do you have a different perspective? Do you think it has affected things differently? Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, though. Thank you for that. That was really awesome.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I can start off by saying that Africa is often paying the price for conflicts we did not start, but we remain economically connected to. Um, he has mentioned about the Ukraine Russia conflict and the supply chains, everything. But what I can say is the fuel prices are usually very sensitive because oil is traded globally. So, for instance, when a major producer like the way Russia was, um, excuse me, the way Russia they had during that war they stopped the, shall I call it, delivery or something. So when it was distracted, it makes the market react almost immediately. Even the expectation that there might be an instability, it pushes those prices of the fuel upward. So, well, um, what I can say is that this war it disrupts normal trade patterns and it shifts the priorities towards like military spending, controlling resources, and everything of the sort. So that makes the sorry that makes the market change probably because now there is the expectation of instability. So even the thought itself that we might have shortage of fuel, so they start holding or they start rising the prices, and that is how the prices rise, and it affects us as a Africa or specifically for Kenya. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Faith. That's also very in introspective there. It helps us see how it permeates specifically to incentives of people. I'd also like to hear what Sydney has to say on this. Sydney, what do you think on this first question? Sydney? Okay, we can segue to okay, Sydney's here. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. To me, I think us as third world countries, this has caused an immense amount of pain because the moment a country that we depend on focuses on war, for instance, we say China. Currently, China is really trying to help Iran because they want their oil to come through the Strait of Hormuz. And with with us, almost all of the products that we use, they are made in China. And almost all the machineries that are producing these products in China, they run on crude oil. Still, they're trying to discover better methods like using electricity. But the moment this crude oil is becoming expensive, and focus is just for this shipment, it means there'll be a hike in price for everything that we use. So what happens if I buy the slipper that I used to buy for 100 shillings? What happens if I buy it for 250? It means Mama Mboga won't be able to afford it. So this has caused even market uncertainty for China itself, because we used to depend on Mutumba, but now we can no longer even afford the Mutumba. The shipping and transportation cost, it has become so high. The insurance company now, they are charging higher. So you find that it's become a bit more challenging for trade to continue. And speaking from a third world country perspective, it has really become a thorn in the flesh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for being on time there. And yeah, I agree. Like the impact of these conflicts and global wars has been very felt a lot in the costs of things. Andrew, do you think there's anything else beyond the costs and the supply chains that has been crucially affected by this uh, place we find ourselves right now?
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So, Michael, I believe that before we even look at that, it's very important for our participants to really understand what the global war economy is. And so, basically, when we talk about, first of all, when we talk about a war economy, we are simply looking at the restructuring of a nation's production, trade, and resource allocation to serve wartime objectives. Interestingly, in the 21st century, this concept has evolved into something larger, and that is what we call the global war economy. So, in very simple terms, we can say that the global war economy is the state in which geopolitical conflicts between major powers restructure the flow of commodities, capital, currencies, and supply chains, as my colleagues have already mentioned, across the entire nation, entire world. And this affects even countries who are not parties of the war. And why is that so? And this is because with a global war economy, all you have to do is be economically integrated through trade, currency, commodity markets with other nations that are at war. And that is why we are seeing Africa in the position in which it is. And of course, as my colleagues have mentioned, fuel prices are really, really very sensitive, and particularly to expectations about supply, transportations, and risk. And so when there are geopolitical tensions, they affect these three key things I've mentioned, and they do cause global oil prices to spike. And that is what we see in Africa.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yes, that's true. And that this has happened for most nations, even from our first conversation on the economics of war. We saw how it caused a lot of restructuring to happen for most economies. At this point, I'd like to bring in Geoffrey to help us wrap up that question. Is there anything significant that you think we've missed out on that specific part?
Yeah, good evening again. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I want to agree with the fellow colleagues that the global economy is kind of defined by global wars, and what has happened is that these are superpowers, all these global powers, they have kind of used energy as a bargaining tool, and in that regard, when we use energy as a bargaining tool, we know what happens. Look, for instance, what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Look what the US is doing to Iran, and look what Iran is doing. Then that has a direct impact on us as Africa who do not take part in these conflicts, yet we rely much on imports of oil. Therefore, looking at that, we can say that Africa, we have a choice, we have an opportunity to see on how we can capitalize on our own resources, and then we become a net exporter, not a net importer in regard to production. Because I think the reason to why we suffer a lot when these global conflicts happen is because we rely much on we rely much on imports, and yet we have the resources. So looking at that, I think we can do something as African countries.
Thank you so much. So, from this first question, what I'm getting is that the economies across the world are very integrated, and as a result, there is some restructuring that happens for most economies when we get into global conflict. At this point, I'd like us to segue into the second question, and I'd like Jeremy and Faith to help us understand the specific ways that these global events that we've highlighted, the likes of Russo-Ukraine war or the US-Iran conflict happening, in what ways have they contributed to these spikes? So maybe you could have a chat on a macro level, how this looks like, and maybe on a micro level, how this looks like. Jeremy?
Okay. So thank you for the question. So the major thing is the disruption in the routes, right? The general or the routes of passage of these shipping containers that move these for example, the Red Sea have made rerouting around Africa, meaning that it's much more expensive. You'd have to pay more on just getting these things traditionally from these places to us. But then again, you need to consider the generic problem, which is things that we even face when it's not even times of war. For example, even the COVID-19 crisis and how it affected foreign exchange. But principally, what's happening is that there's a demand supply much, and that anytime there is regress in the situation, especially from the in context, the Russian-Ukraine war gave saw things like sanctions. When Russia is a major exporter and we benefit largely from them, when there are sanctions, it means that we are less likely to get as much oil as we used to get from them. What that necessarily meant was that the prices went high, and that's very easy for us to understand. And this inflation, it trickles down into much more serious inflations that affects the things we buy and consume, etc. And so in that regard, I think at the individual level, given the routes, etc., the mere fact that price and inflation is triggered necessarily makes it very detrimental for just us in that particular regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I agree, those three mechanisms are sometimes the most direct. Faith, do you think there are any other mechanisms that the wars transmit this prices hike?
Thank you, Michael. I think Jeremy has said a lot about it. And I will only say, like, I remember a time my brother and I, after the Iran war started, he once told me, from where I sit, I think these fuel prices are going to go high. And it is because of, let me say, instability. So instability in oil producing regions like the Middle East, I'd say it increased uncertainty, is which and the uncertainty led to the I don't want to repeat myself. I'll just refer to that Micah story and say it's more of the uncertainty. Yes, and also, for instance, with when the shipping disruptions and attacks around the trade routes increase, it increases the transport and insurance costs as well. And those things are no longer determined by, they demonstrate that the fuel prices, they are no longer determined by it's you start seeing that taking other measures that are going to, of course, make the prices higher. So, yeah, thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Faith. So at this point, it's clear that when these conflicts happen, disruptions happen, and other pertinent issues from the past, like, for example, COVID-19 and demand and supply shock chains, lead to the fuel spikes in prices. So at this point, I'd like Sydney, maybe you walk us through how does this translate into food prices? Because around the globe and in Africa specifically, we've seen people complain that prices of things have gone high. So, how do these conflicts contribute to this fundamentally?
Well, actually, in Africa, they say a way to a man's heart is through the stomach. This thing, it is really disturbing because considering this war, it is terrific to hear about the war for a man. Because you can imagine with the rising prices in fuel, what can happen. Okay, we do say that there are small scale farmers, but those who provide for the nation, they're the large scale farmers. But what do the large scale farmers use? They tend to use tractors, they tend to use huge chunks of fertilizers, and also they tend to transport using transits to the market. So what happens when the fuel prices are up? It means that for a tractor to function in the farm, it needs double the cost that used to be used. The fertilizers, it means this guy has to spend double of what he spent the previous season, and which means he'll try to manage the cost. And later you'll see that the amount of crops that the guy is trying to plant this season compared to the previous season is a little bit smaller. Let me use the word smaller. And this will affect because now the silos and the stores in Kenya, they'll be empty. There'll be not the normal amount of food that used to be produced by the country. And the farmer himself will fear the cost of transporting the goods to the market because he tends to think, what if the market still wants the normal price and I'm still incurring a loss that I used never to incur. So what happens after this? So you'll find the food sector is immensely affected and there'll be little supply of food in the market and the farmers will also be demoralized. Yes, let me use the word demoralized and they'll shift to other things, maybe just substantial. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I agree. From what Sydney has said, we've seen there's some level of food inflation that happens because the overhead costs become a little bit too high and very difficult for most of these farmers to keep up with. Just to help us understand the inflation more, Andrew, could you help us demystify how inflation specifically rises because of these fuel prices beyond maybe food related conversation?
Okay. All right. Thank you, Michael. So, it's very important to know that fuel is a critical input in almost every sector of an economy. And as such, increases in fuel prices have far-reaching effects that go beyond transportation to as far as food and even well-being or welfare of households. In Africa, particularly, a large share of households' income is spent on food and energy. Now, let's look at how this whole inflation thing happens. It happens as a result of the ripple effect. So it all begins with the persistent increase in the prices of fuel. So fuel cost keeps going high, and it affects transportation, and it eventually affects food. And this is because most of our food sources, which are our farms, are not closer to the cities which usually buy them. And so these food items or commodities have to be transported from the farm side to the city, and that is done by vehicles, and these vehicles run on fuel. And so when fuel is expensive, the driver driving the fuel has to pay about twice or maybe more just for the same amount of fuel he was buying before. In doing that, he's going to take up some extra expenses. And so he's going to charge whoever's goods he's conveying from the site to the city, he's going to charge more. And that trader also coming to the city to sell the food commodity would also have to move that cost into her price. And so the price of food then becomes expensive. And we see that inflation is occurring. And this kind of inflation we are looking at is what we call the cost pool inflation, right? The cost pool inflation, and this is sorry, the cost push inflation, and this occurs as a result of the persistent increase in the prices of raw materials, or the cost of paying wages, paying workers. And that is what we see in the scenario I gave. And when that happens, for individuals or companies to maintain their profit margin, although cost has increased, or production cost has increased, they then have to pass on that cost to the consumer. And that is why when fuel prices increase, we see that translate into the increment in transportation, eventually moving on to the increment in food, amongst many other components, causing this ripple effect.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Allow me to have Geoffrey weigh in. Geoffrey, are there any other ways that maybe have not been mentioned that these uh, things we've discussed trickle down to, welfare of families and people in general?
Uh, Thank you, Michael. I can look at the household level. When we talk about the household, let's just simply talk about the consumer. And in our case, let's just talk about the local mwananchi, the Wajiri in our case. And one thing we need to recognize that, as a colleague has said, that is the engine of any economy, and any disruption in our supply chains will always affect the consumer or the household. And in this regard, the household will always have to pay higher prices for goods and services. We'll have to incur huge cost in terms of transport. Talk about in terms of the cooking gas, all the LPGs and kerosene and all that. And then this will always affect the consumer welfare or the household welfare at large. Therefore, I can just conclude briefly that when these fuel prices rise, household rather will not only spend more, they will consume less, and then they will save less, and this definitely will affect the household welfare, the consumer welfare at large. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. After this conversation, there's something interesting I have in mind. There are some African countries that are oil producers, yet we still face this severe price volatility has been highlighted. Jeremy, could you help us understand why does Africa appear particularly vulnerable to these global fuel price shocks, despite some countries having this oil within their country bases?
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. Um, I think it's a complicated problem. Oftentimes, we often say that uh, we have to refine more because the cost that you pay for refining oftentimes is more expensive than the extraction that these African countries do. And the mere fact that we refine so little means that we are losing that particular trade at the end of the day. But for me, it boils down to us understanding, first of all, how we use oil or revenues that we get from oil. Because most at times, every state has gone through this particular struggle of refinery, and because the technology, developing the technology is very expensive, etc. But then what that means is that reinvesting the oil revenue, particularly into refining systems and technologies in that particular regard, is a long-term thinking strategy that essentially boosts these African states in that regard that I think they do not do. But secondly, too, I think is the nature of the contracts. So at any point in time you predict for instabilities, what you do to protect yourself is that you engage in futures contracts. What that means is that because in the vast majority of instances, we don't have very good reserves because the United States currently has reserves that would outlast at least as a decade. That's 10 years, but African states would collapse in a few years. What that means is that futures contracts ensures that you can get stable pricing by having a contract that says that despite whatever is happening in the global war economy, they are going to sell us fuel at this particular price or refined fuel at this particular price. And I think that's particularly where we need to be looking at. But then again, too, we have very little intra-continental trade when it comes to this, or very strong intra-continental markets. that support this industry. What that means is that if we want to refine, Ghana doesn't send its oil largely to Nigeria, where Dangote exists or Dangote's refinery is. Probably take it out to somewhere in Europe to get it refined, and that is more expensive in that particular regard. And so, at the end of the day, we need to find how we can get that internal continental collaboration that boosts these things and subsidize cost at best at the end of the day. Thank you.
Nice. I love what Jeremy has said, specifically on the intra trade that is not happening as efficiently as it could have. Sydney, do you have anything else to weigh in on this specific conversation?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, for me, I think the big issue is about corruption. What happens to countries like Nigeria? I'm going in my home country. We once had a refinery plant in Turkana, but unfortunately, it just ran for like 6 months and then it died. It it died actually, and the main reason was just corruption. The people of Turkana wanted that those who were to be employed in that specific area only to be from that area, while the country was really trying to employ everyone from the country. But also, those in power wanted to consume all the profits that were being gained from that area. Also, the other issue is of independency. To we really rely too much in imports. What happens if we promote the SMEs, the micro industries in the country? Will we need the clothes that we always import? Will we need the cars? What happens if we build in in our country? What happens when we believe that our wananchi can promote the industrial part of the nation? It means we won't be importing the inflation that is being gained from this war. It means there'll be a reduction of fuel dependence if we promote our own plants in the country. It means that also there will be substantial energy if we promote the geothermal which we have in our country and promote the use of electric cars in the country. There'll be no longer the dependence of foreign aid. And also, to to add on that, for countries like Nigeria, where they actually they're a major producer of oil. They do mine a lot of oil there, but you find that tribalism, nepotism, and all these
Kiango, wewe gito,
third world countries, they really
kitu
so if
mixing
work of
hapa.
that things will be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for that. I agree with majority of what you've said in terms of the things that are causing us to still experience and be vulnerable to these global fuel shocks. Faith and Andrew, could you help us understand beyond the global oil prices that we've highlighted have a significant impact on these prices? Do you think things like domestic policies, like currency depreciation or fiscal policies that countries have, play any role in the fuel prices that we witness in status quo currently?
Okay, all right. Thank you, Michael. So, yes, so in Africa, fuel prices are driven by a combination of both the global oil market dynamics and domestic economic factors. While global crude oil prices influence the baseline cost of petroleum products, we must also understand that domestic issues such as currency depreciation, taxation, subsidy reforms, as well as regulatory policies, often determine the final price consumers pay. And in Africa, these domestic factors tend to amplify or outweigh the impact on of global oil prices. So let's look at some case studies. We can use Nigeria as a case study. So we know that historically, Nigeria has maintained large fuel subsidies to keep petrol prices low. But somewhere in 2023, when the government removed fuel subsidies, we saw that the prices of petrol more than doubled, right? Also, we can look at my very own beloved country, Ghana. In terms of currency depreciation, we realized that somewhere 2022, 2023, when Ghana experienced some significant depreciation against the US dollar, fuel prices increased even though within during that period, international oil prices were stable or declining, right? And this was key mainly as a result of the weakening CD relative to the dollar, and this raised the cost of importing petroleum products. And so it's not just about the global oil prices, it's also about our internal or domestic factors, a combination of both, but with the domestic factors outweighing the global oil prices.
All right, thank you so much, Andrew, for that. I agree. Faith, do you think maybe do you agree with what Andrew has said that domestic factors play a crucial role, even greater role than the global fuel prices?
Thank you, Michael. I agree with what Andrew has just said. And I'll say that for us Africans, we usually import. So when the value of our African currency weaken and usually purchase the fuel in dollars, if our currency weakens, then the imports become more expensive. So that's a big problem to a point that even if we have subsidies, for instance, from the government, it won't play a big role because the adjustments will just be minimal. So the global prices may be the problem, but domestic problems, the domestic macroeconomic conditions are the ones which determine majorly painful, how painful the impact becomes.
Thank you so much, Faith. I agree with the sentiments from both Andrew and Faith that domestic factors play a critical role in the surge in prices we experience. So it's important for all of us, even as we think about these things, not to blame them on wars a lot. You can see how, specifically in Africa, this works. There's something pertinent that has been mentioned by both panelists, that subsidies sometimes help. And I want Geoffrey and Jeremy to help me understand something which is very controversial. Yeah, many governments face pressure to subsidize fuel prices because people believe that will help people cope with the surging prices. So are these subsidies unnecessary protection for citizens during these crisis periods, or do they create more problems, as Andrew and Faith alluded to? Geoffrey, you can help us weigh in on that first, then Jeremy.
Thank you very much. As subsidies, I would start to say that by saying that in the short run, subsidies may cushion the consumer or the household, and as well, it may, in a way, help relieve the citizens during that time or that period of crisis. But in the long run, subsidies may not be sustainable or may not be the solution. One, we need to look at subsidies in this way. Rather than these Africa countries relying on subsidies, why can't they find a local solution or a solution that can help in the short run and the long run? For example, Kenya, we avoided some fuel subsidies during the previous regime, and it was removed. Recent, we saw what happened, and by relying on subsidies, what that would mean that in the long run, or rather, pardon, in the long run, if we rely on subsidies, these African countries will not develop in the sense that will not capitalize on the resources which they have. Therefore, rather than relying on subsidies, let these Africa countries enhance local production. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those important sentiments. Jeremy, do you agree with what Geoffrey has, and do you have anything, interesting to add on that?
So, subsidies, I mean, subsidies is a good idea. At any point in time, um, your state, individuals within the state, because I mean, it's develops into greater forms of inflation. So if government subsidize, it means it can internally control the very extreme um, harms and effects of high petroleum prices. But then it is, first of all, it's expensive to do because um, you now have to put up money for the changes in prices. And Andrew shows you that the relative fluctuations of the dollar and African currencies is very, like, it's so wild that it becomes very expensive for these states to keep it up. That means the question of how sustainable this is becomes a very big problem. For how long can you sustain it? Because the wars have been going on for a long time now, and how long can these states survive this? So if you want to survive you have to consider the kind of debt that government incurs at the end of the day, because the real problem is the strength of the dollar and the concept of petrodollars. And what petrodollars do in essence is that they find a way to keep strengthening the um, like in a way is that most of the suppliers of these of crude oil of refined fuel say that you can only get it when you bring dollars. All right, that's what the market looks like. And for African states, as we've already explained to you, is that when we export and we buy, and like importers buy our raw oil from, they buy it in dollars and we keep those dollars. The problem is that we immediately release those dollars to buy refined fuel, which is more expensive. What that means is that we have less amount of dollar reserves than we had even before the trade began. Why that is important and why it's significantly beneficial is that
I don't know if
you
it's
can purchase
just
more
me.
dollars at the end of the day,
Oh.
putting it in very in high debt situations at the end of the day. Thank you.
All right, sorry. Thank you, Jeremy. I think we had lost you for a while, but we've gotten a vast of what you've said, and I agree that sometimes subsidies are not as impactful in mitigating the prices, especially in the long run, because of the surge they create. Thank you so much, Jeremy and Jeffrey. At this point, I'd want us to segue to understand: are there any lessons that African governments can draw from this geopolitical conflict, specifically with what we've highlighted so far? Maybe Faith, you can help us get a gist of some lessons we can draw from this.
Thank you, Michael. And Andrew earlier mentioned things to do with reserves, and the Western nations like Asia and whatever, they usually have some 90-day petroleum reserves stuff. So, what if we have reserves for we as African countries where we reserve our own oil so that when we have such moments like right now when we have the war, we'll always have our own well that can sustain us for a certain period of time. Then we can also I think it was Sydney or was it Jeremy? I can't really remember. They said about we it is easier for us to buy from other countries than buying from our neighboring countries. Like Ghana has fuel, same to Nigeria, but Kenya we can't buy from them. How about we have some regional integration whereby we can purchase from each other? We can combine forces, let me say, join forces. Since the problem is refining our own oil, have a way where we can refine our own oil and trade amongst each other than depending on those other nations, sorry, continents like Asia and whatever. Then I feel like we also have the over reliance on refined products. We can always, unite as Africa and do our stuff, refine our own. That will really, really uh, go a long way for us. And also, we can invest in storage facilities, in tanks, deep water ports, invest in storage facilities. Because if we store our own, when crisis hit, we have stored our own, which can sustain us for a certain period. We won't have to start panicking and all of that. Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much for those fine insights, Faith. Sydney and Andrew, maybe in a minute each, are there any other lessons African governments can draw from our current situation?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there are great lessons that we should have learned. First, I think it's the to invest more in efficient public transport, because people tend to think that if I use my own private vehicle, I'll be saving. But in actual sense, you are overspending. What if an area, maybe let's say in Karen, people decide that we'll be going together in a van to work, and also the same person will be picking us today? There'll be no they'll be saving, and there'll be no reliance in fuel consumption which we import. And what if the country invests more in railway station? I tend to think Tanzania betters in that. Tanzania and Ethiopia, they're using electric trains. This means that most of the people will not be relying on the fuel that the government is intending to import. And also we should diversify the energy sources. Instead of daily depending on petroleum, we can use solar energy. We can also use wind energy. Kenya through KenGen has tried to make use of the hydroelectric stations, like KenGen. We have the wind turbines also, but still we can do more. I tend to think that we can do more, and through this, I think the lessons will help a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. Andrew, do you have any additional lessons that African countries can draw that haven't been mentioned?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So, Michael, geopolitical tensions over the years have proven to us that energy dependence is a strategic liability for Africa. And as such, Africa must build refining capacity. We must also come up with strategic reserves and regional energy trade, and not just upstream production. And we see this with what I call the Dangote model. Let's briefly appreciate some statistics. So before 2024, or that was, yes, Nigeria's fuel needs. Um,
And Faith to weigh in on. Currently, we are seeing we saw something was if these current geopolitical tensions persist, what do you anticipate for fuel markets in Africa over the next 5 years? Specifically, what should be the strategic approach Jeremy, and then
Okay.
Faith,
And
you
a
have
lot of
after this.
conversation around conversation so far shows that there's a lot of problems within the fuel economy within African states or the continent at large. The question is, as you've rightly put it, within the next 5 years, what are the things we can do that better positions us at the end of the day? I think, firstly, if we cannot necessarily work on the refinery and we can't deal with the strength of our currencies. Firstly, what we should do is to try and find alternative energy sources, because the biggest consumer of these petroleum products is that we goes directly into energy, fueling our national grid and the stuff that we use to run our like the engine for our society. So let's find renewable, cheaper alternatives, solar, wind, etc. That can soften the burden on African states when global war shocks etc hits. But then again, too, we can point out building up larger reserve systems. What that means is that in periods of low crisis or low global war and or activity that creates heightened forward prices and shocks, what you do is that you save up a lot of the fuel or you buy excess and you keep them so that just in case there are periods where unpredicted points of conflict happen within these geopolitical actors, you are better positioned to not suffer from these fluctuating prices that lead to inflation and then weaker states at the end of the day. And so I think those two things particularly are the safest for us, at least, to get us somewhere. And then we can think about the innovations that are necessary to get us there.
All right. I think we've lost Jeremy again, but I think he had already concluded on his submission. We keep losing you, but at least you are done. Faith, beyond the macro level on states, what things do you think businesses and actual citizens can do to be prepared in the eventuality that these conflicts persist?
Thank you, Michael. I think businesses should invest in energy efficient operations and they reduce the dependence on the systems. Like, if the businesses should also try and be dependent, like not be dependent on other fuel incentive systems. As for the citizens, I think we have the role to do energy conservation. We need to adopt uh, embracing alternative transport options, which are going to help us, you know, conserve energy and more efficient consumption patterns. So, yeah, that is it for the citizens and for the businesses from me.
Thank you so much, Faith, for that. At this point, having heard all we've had, I'd like to pass off the baton to the audience. I'm going to take just three questions. And as you ask your questions, please be brief and concise and to the point. Don't go over very many stories. Be as brief as possible. We're going to start with Duke. Anyone else who has a question, you can also raise it after Duke. So I'll take Duke and two more people. Duke.
Hello, I had an addition, not a question, so maybe I can preserve that chance. I can leave those who have questions first to ask.
You have 90 seconds. Yeah, because I've not seen any questions as of yet.
Okay, thank you. So my concern was about some issues that you had left out. Okay, you had not left out, but I just want to echo from my own view. You see, these are economic recessions and these are global economic wars. These are things that have been happening if you read the economic history. So, and we should look at how different economies adapted or adjusted so that or reacted to these economic shocks. I just took an example of President Frederick from USA when there was economic issue back in 1929 or 1930. And so you can see the approach that he took. So sometimes when we are faced with such issues, for example, the current issue that we are faced of petroleum and, or let me say, energies, these issues are supposed to be approached, should I say, in a macro way. For example, if you see President Frederick, he approached there are three things that he tackled when they were faced with a crisis, and I think this is the same thing that we should employ as African countries. We should look at the agriculture sector, which is the leading sector in these countries, and also the, how do we call it? I'm sorry, I'm not a good speaker, so you can just bear with me. And I said agricultural sector, and then we have the monetary sector, and there's another sector that I've forgotten. So, for example, if you look at African countries, we are not able to absorb these shocks, and this is something that is affecting us. Actually, these energy issues is affecting every country in the world, but why is it that African countries are really suppressed by this economic issue? It's because we cannot absorb these shocks. So we should implement ways that we can absorb these shocks, because we cannot eradicate economic issues. These are things that will always come. So let us look for ways that we can eradicate. For example, I heard Faith talking about coming up with a way to make our own oil and petroleum. I'm sorry, I'm not a good speaker, just bear with me. So we should come up with those ways and eradicate it once and for all. We should tackle things not just to solve the present issues only, but also to tackle issues in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamu. And that concludes our conversation today. I think that was very insightful. At this point, are there any questions? I'll just take, okay, there's a question in the chat. Let me look at it. Um, okay, given the EPRA price setting is essentially price control, what happens if the Kenyan economy uses market force to determine fuel prices? Who will maximize the consumer welfare? Andrew, can you help us? No, not Andrew, Geoffrey, since you're a Kenyan, but Andrew can also weigh in because it involves things around, the consumer welfare. Or Mushiri has a contribution to that. So maybe Mushiri, you can help us answer that question. Yes.
Well, I didn't intend to contribute to that, but a different one.
Oh, sorry. It's all right. Maybe Geoffrey, could you help us answer George's question in the chat, and then we'll have Mushiri's contribution.
Uh, uh, Given, oh, or rather, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can get you clearly, Geoffrey.
Okay, thank you. Uh, Given that given that IPRA is the one which determines prices of goods and services, or rather prices of fuel, and it relies on some indicators to determine the price of fuel. Now, if we leave the market to the forces of demand and supply, yes, the price may be stable, the price maybe in a way stabilized, but again, the government has to intervene in a way such that if the importers, for example, we bought these fuels, for example, right now we have the crisis in the Middle East and the barrel of the oils are very high. If we leave the market, the forces of demand forces, the price may stabilize, but again, it will be a challenge. It will pose a challenge because simply in one or the other, we need the government to kind of look at the prices, or the prices that will not either way affect the consumer, such that it's too high or it's too low for the business to be affected. Therefore, I feel like leaving the market to the forces of demand and supply is okay, but again, we also need the government in a way to weigh in a way such that the consumer welfare is kind of in balance.
Thank you so much. I think that's very insightful. Finally, I think I'll have Mushiri as we conclude because we are 3 minutes beyond our time. Yes, Moses.
All right. Hopefully, I can do this quick, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Moses.
Okay, perfect. So, well, on what the just concluded question. Well, first of all, allowing the market forces to determine price is always the best case scenario. Now, there's some things that have been mentioned: subsidies, Africa having its own oil system. I would want to point out to everybody that the USA is the leading producer of oil in the world as of today. Their prices have risen by 50%. Kenya prices have risen by about 25%, the worst level. So producing oil is not necessarily an indicator that you're going to have lower prices. As you all pointed out, oil is a global commodity. No one country sets the price. The price are set by global factors. And what all that means is that irrespective of whether you're producing oil or not, if prices are rising because of a shock, they are going to rise everywhere. And this is the basic reason for it. If you are
prices are lower than anybody else in the world, then everybody in the world would buy from you. And as we all know, that will push the prices up. So automatically prices will equalize irrespective of whether you're producing oil or not. And therefore, there's little intervention governments can do when there's a supply shock. Now, the mechanism to do here is not necessary to have Africa produce its own oil or refine its own oil. That might be not necessary at all. But the idea of government saving people from the shock is necessary. And in that end, I support that we need subsidies, temporary subsidies that are supposed to save the day when there is difficulty. Not like Kenyan system of subsidizing, which happens irrespective. That would be very helpful. But the idea that Africa can produce all it wants and close itself against the world will not work. There's nothing like sovereignty as far as production is concerned. Well, Nigeria might claim that Gote refinery is a success. I don't think it is. I think it's a monopoly. But either way, um, I think it's important to point out that this problem of price hike is being caused in the world. The best way to have prices drop is just the world urging the US to stop attacking Iran and everything reverts. And but the other alternative on local policies may be if oil is taxed heavily in your country to cut that, or maybe use temporary subsidies to save people for and hope the shock will not last. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Moses. That summarizes our discussion. We've gotten that while global geopolitical crossfires directly affect African pumps, the solution heavily rely on our proactivity as Africans to call out nations like the US and our internal capacity to build self-reliance. So it's imperative that we build refining capacity to some extent, we execute strategic short-term subsidies as has been highlighted, and we also integrate our markets through frameworks like the African Continental Free Trade Area. That has been our time today. Thank you to everyone for logging in and engaging with us when we were having this conversation. Thank you to our PRM team for the brilliant job of rallying the numbers. We've had very many people engaging in the course of the session. Thank you to our beautiful panelists for the insights you've given, Jeremy and Andrew, all the way from Ghana. Thank you for sparing your time for us. For Faith, thank you for taking your time away from your examination preparations to be with us. For Sydney, thank you for sparing time as well to just be with us.